couple of months ago, we started a series through the Gospel of Matthew. And in Matthew's Gospel, we get this picture, a bigger picture of what Christ is coming to do. And he's coming to establish this kingdom. And someday there's this future hope. There's this heaven. There's this Christ setting up a kingdom on earth and all these things the Old Testament speaks of and the Jews were looking forward to and we're still looking forward to in many respects. But there's also an element when Jesus talks about his kingdom of this present reality. He wants to change people's lives, not later on, not someday, not after their life on earth is over, but he wants to start changing us now and the way that we live and make life so much more fulfilling and so much more beneficial for other people as well. And the Sermon on the Mount is kind of Jesus, like I would say one of the pinnacle teachings as far as how we live out our faith. We've entered into the middle of that. And last week we took a look at one aspect, and it's the fact that many of us, we have treasures in this life. We have stuff. We have money. We have resources. And in many ways, our culture, it kind of drives us toward that. Especially here in the United States, we're very blessed overall. Comparatively with many parts of the world, we're very blessed materially. And many other places in the world maybe feel that way as well. But one of the dangers of that is we feel like life is all about getting more and more stuff, earning more and more money, becoming secure, having a great retirement, experiencing everything life has to offer. But Jesus gave us a little bit of a different picture of that last week. He talks about how our treasures, they can trip us up. And we have to be careful to invest those treasures in heavenly things, not just in this world, because ultimately that stuff is going to go away or we're just going to leave it behind. And there's a segment of people that are probably in here today, and that maybe didn't really hit home for you because you don't feel like you have an abundance. Some of us feel like we're doing well. We have a little bit of extra, so we can look to spread that out and give beyond just ourselves. Or we have a little extra and we feel like we can use it to enjoy life. But there are others of you here, or maybe you're watching online as well, and you say, I don't feel that way at all, especially given what's happening right now in our world. I feel like I'm scraping to get by. I'm living paycheck to paycheck, and things are tight in a financial sense. And that's kind of the counterbalance Jesus is going to give us today. He's going to speak into those types of things and to those of us who are feeling not a surplus, but maybe a shortage of the things we feel like we need to just live and have our needs met and get by with in life. When I was in college, when I was in university, about my third year of school, I was looking for different ways to help pay for my education. But I also wanted to keep my grades up, and so I knew that I couldn't look very far away to get jobs. And I found out that they were hiring for RAs, resident assistants, and so those are just different individuals who are kind of in charge of the dormitories and the different floors in the dorms. And so at my particular school, they had 2 RAs per floor. And so I signed up and went through this training process, and then eventually they would kind of weed people out and choose who they wanted for their RAs, and then those people would get a half scholarship that year. And so that's how I was able to pay for at least half of the last couple of years of my education each year was by becoming an RA. But one thing that struck me as interesting about this process was how they trained us. I've been through trainings before, and normally it's you sit down in the classroom and you're taking some notes, and they're telling you about their policies and how they want you to perform, and maybe what the dress code's like in a certain business environment or what the expectations are for a job. And this was very different. They had us do some strange things. They put us in groups and they said, okay, we're going to do this thing called a trust fall. So here's a platform, and we want you to each take a turn standing on the platform, and then this other group of trainees are going to be behind you. And we want you just to kind of fall back and trust that they're going to catch you off this platform. And so we took turns doing the trust fall. Then they got out some mattresses, and they said, okay, we're going to do some relay races. And one of these relays is one of you is going to be on the mattress, and then the others of you are going to be laying down on the ground. And you're going to pass the person on the mattress across over you. And then when you get to the end, everybody's going to scoot back around except for the last couple of people under the mattress. They're going to pause for a moment, and everybody else is going to move in front. And so it's like a conveyor belt system to move people across this mattress. Then they had a room, and it was set up like a minefield. And they said, you've got a few objects, and you need to stay on these objects to make a pathway across the room without touching the floor. And then they blindfolded us and had us like follow the leader blindfolded. And I'm thinking, this is the strangest training I've ever been a part of in my life. And that wasn't all of it, all right? That was just a component of it. But it struck me as funny. But the reason why they did that, I later realized, is because we would need to develop a trust, a sense of trust in each other. One, every RA has a partner on their floor, and they don't always see things the same way. They might not make the same decisions initially or react to every situation that happens on a dorm floor the same way as I would. And so there has to be an element of trust. Also, there's kind of some strange things that you come up against on university dorm floors sometimes, and you have to be prepared for the unexpected. And you have to sometimes consult other people, other resident assistants, and say, how should I handle this? Or even your boss, things like that. What do we do? So there's got to be a trust factor. And they knew we have to train them not just to follow through with the policies and to do what they're supposed to do, but we have to train them to trust each other. So that's a part of the training experience. And that's very much what we're looking at today. Jesus is going to start to train us, but not in the sense that we would expect. He wants to train our trust. He wants to train our faith in him. And sometimes it's very difficult to respond in faith to God because we have some things, quite honestly, in our life that we're very concerned about. And I think maybe at this time specifically, a lot of those concerns, at least for some of us here, drift toward finances, groceries, gas prices, and all these things that keep going up and up and up. And maybe our income and our resources, they don't keep following that track of going up and up and up. I was just doing a little bit of thinking and looking back and doing some research online, but here locally, fuel prices, they've gone up $1.70 per gallon in the last 5 months here in La Verkin, Utah. That's over a 50% increase in 5 months. I went to go get my car worked on a couple of weeks ago, and the service writer said, yeah, we've heard that you can expect $6 a gallon by August, so just get prepared. It's like, oh, wonderful, because we're planning on taking a road trip for a vacation in August, so that's perfect. I thought about things in the grocery. The $19 bag of chicken at Costco is now $28.99, just a few months. The $3.19 gallon of milk at the local grocery, at least at the one here in La Verkin, is almost $4.50 a gallon. Now, you can find deals if you shop around, but things have gone up. In fact, there's a consumer price index, and it said in the last year, from 2021 April to 2022 April, prices in groceries have gone up 10%. And they said by the end of 2022, expect another 7 to 8% increase in that. We noticed recently that our health insurance was going up by $65 a month, and mortgage rates are on the rise now, and rent and housing here locally is at an all-time historical high. And so many of us, we start to get concerned because our incomes are limited to some degree. And sometimes we even get fearful that we're not going to have enough. We're not going to have our needs met. And maybe the following words that Jesus is going to speak to us this morning, that he spoke 2,000 years ago, but are still very relevant to us, probably couldn't have come at a more perfect time. This is the first thing he says in our passage today. It's Matthew 6:25 to 34. He says, this is why I tell you, don't worry. Don't worry. And the context is in finances. We just talked about what we do with our surplus, how to invest the extra that we have in God's kingdom here last week. So that's the context. It's finances, it's financial anxiety. And I just put on the notes first, when we feel financial anxiety, which many of you may be feeling right now, we tend to forget a few important truths about God and about money. The first thing Jesus said before he said don't worry is, this is why I tell you don't worry. And it's going to point us back to a few truths that we looked at last Sunday. And it's going to point us forward to a few truths that we're going to look at today. And all of those different truths are things that we need to keep in mind when we start to worry, especially about not having our needs met in life. And here's what Jesus told us last week. Here's a little review. So here's some things that we should remember. This is part of the reason why we shouldn't worry. One, last week we learned that some people are given a surplus by God to share. So don't immediately react with worry, because when you're having a shortage, there may be other people around you that God's given a surplus to. And maybe that's to help produce some equality in each other's lives. Secondly, Jesus taught us last week, wealth, it's got a lifespan, and it also becomes a liability. So don't think just because you have extra, life is going to get a lot easier and a lot better. He also said your hearts end up following your treasures last week. So if you have too much treasure in this life, your heart's going to gravitate toward it. You'll get obsessed with it. So maybe the fact that you don't have a lot right now and you feel like you don't have enough, that's actually safeguarding your heart to some degree against getting attached to everything that's materialistic in this life. And the last thing Jesus said was, it's impossible to serve God and money. So maybe it's to point us toward which master we should really be trying to serve. The fact that we don't have enough points us away from money's ability to kind of control us and take us over, and maybe points our attention to God, and maybe that's where our attention needs to be focused in the first place. Worries are kind of like a tug of war on us. The very next thing Jesus says after don't worry, he says, don't worry about your life. Don't be anxious about your life. And the idea is how to sustain your life. That word for life in this New Testament context, it meant you're breathing, so it's ongoing. It's, you're sustaining of your life. Don't worry about those things. What you'll eat, what you'll drink, about your body, what you're going to wear, so your clothes, your closet. Don't worry about all those things. Instead, there's something better that you should focus on. And Jesus is suggesting, again, like in that previous verse, you can't serve both God and money, that we realize who we really should be serving in the first place. And he's trying to get us to realize that if we embrace God as our master, we can release our fears of not having enough. Because God, he is not a cruel master. And this is back in the world of the Roman Empire. Slavery was prevalent everywhere. At this point in time, a third of the population of Rome, which was several 100,000 people, maybe upwards to 1 million people at this point in time, a third of those people, so maybe 200,000 or 300,000 people were slaves. Slavery was all over the world empire. And many masters were not wonderful people. They would take advantage of their slaves. And so Jesus is saying, in that context, God is like the master that you've never known in this life. He is the good, the caring master. Money, maybe not so much so. Maybe money will, disappoint you at some point. But God, he'll always take care of you. And so if you have God and he's looking out for you and he's taking care of you, don't automatically react with worry. Because there's somebody out there who's a lot bigger than you are. He cares about you. He loves you. He knows your situation. And he's looking out for you. He wants to provide for you. We're going to find that more in the next couple of verses. He says next, isn't life more than food and the body more than clothing? Think about your life. What encompasses our life? Isn't there a little bit more to it than just eating a meal? A little bit more to it than picking out what you're going to wear in the morning? Life is a full experience. At least Jesus intends for it to be. And so if we're focused in and we're worried all the time about these 2 or 3 different elements of life, we're going to miss out on so much more that life has to offer. There's more to life than just these physical needs and our concerns. It doesn't feel like it at the time, especially if your finances are tight, and you don't know how you're going to pay for the next bill that's coming. But just step back. Jesus says, remember, there's more to life than these needs. It's a bigger thing than that. It's more than just surviving. And also, if you have a surplus, like we talked about last week, it's more than just luxury, right? Because last week the problem was if you have extra, you tend to think, well, life is all about ease and enjoyment. It's all about luxury. How can I get the most out of life for me and experience all the things that are out there and take it easy and have comforts and all those things, especially if maybe earlier in your life you didn't have those kinds of things and now you have the ability to access them. A life is more than that as well. There's more to life than the stuff and the needs and the finances. A full life is more than that. Jesus is going to take us to a few things in nature to remind us of that next in verse 26. He says, look at the birds of the sky. They don't plant or harvest or gather food into barns, but your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you worth more than they are? You ever thought about that? If you're going through a really difficult time financially, look outside. There's a lot of creatures that are making do just fine, right, with everything that's around them. They don't have the same even resources that you have, but yet God's taking care of them. Don't you think you're a little bit more valuable to God than they are? Sure, they're valuable. They're a creation just like everything else, but you were made in God's image. And so you have this connection, this ability to relate with God and to think in a much deeper way, to feel in a much deeper way. You're more complex, and far more capable of relating with God personally and acknowledging him than these creatures. Yet, he tends to take care of their needs all the time. It says your heavenly Father feeds them. So he's a father figure. Maybe you had a terrible father figure in your life. I don't know. But God here is presented as a loving father. So you may have to redefine father in your mind. He's a loving father who greatly values you and me, and he's going to consistently supply our needs. And that's one of the things that fathers or mothers tend to do. They take care of their kids, right? They provide for their kids' needs. They'll buy the groceries. They'll fix the meals. They'll do a lot of work around the house. They want to take care of them. And as God's child, he wants to take care of you. He doesn't want to hang you out to dry. He doesn't want you to lack food on the table. He doesn't always want you to be stressed about not having enough. He's going to take care of you because he's a good father. And it says here, the birds, they're kind of just surrounded with what they need, right? They look in their environment and they find the food that's there. And they find the shelter that's there. And in the same way, God surrounds us with different resources we need each day. Just like the birds, even more so than the birds, because we're more valuable, more important. Even if we can't always plan ahead or plant or things like that, God takes care of us. How might God surround you with resources? There have been a lot of ways in my life where I feel like God has done that for me, but sometimes it might take this form. Sometimes God might put somebody else in your life who has a surplus, and so God might provide what you need through them. We actually have a table. I'm not sure if it'll be here after church because of our church fellowship that kind of rearranges our kitchen. But now we have kind of it says the market in our kitchen area here, and there's some different baskets. And especially this time of year when people have extra vegetables, extra fruits, extra produce, or other things in their life that they don't need, they'll bring them in and they'll put them in these baskets. And so it's basically, we have some extra, we're going to leave that there. And if that's something that you can use, then you're free to take it. And again, that's just one small avenue that we have available here for you to leave some extra things or take some things that you could use in your life as far as food, especially things of that nature. But there may be other places in life where you can do that. We even have food pantries and food banks that are here locally. Maybe it's through someone's generosity. Maybe it's through somebody observing a need that you have. Maybe it's through a job opportunity. You don't have enough resources, and all of a sudden this opportunity appears, or you hear about some opportunity for work or a side job, or you're looking through the classifieds online or something, and you see, oh, there's a gig here, and I can go for an afternoon and make some money. There was a time in my life when we were going on a family vacation, and I needed about $500 more than what I had, and I thought, you know what? I'm not really a fan of this, but I've heard about BioLife, and I've heard that I could donate blood plasma. And so I signed up for BioLife to save up enough money for the vacation and discovered a few things in the process. It's tough for me. I have really small veins, and so it wasn't a very fun experience for me. But I was able to get the money I needed for the vacation before we left. And so it was something God put in the world around me. It was there to provide. Maybe there's different circumstances. Maybe it's a program that you can get involved in. Maybe it's using public transportation or finding other ways to cut costs that are available to you. Maybe it's searching grocery ads and coupons. Maybe it's through attending different events, and maybe those include food along with it. There's different resources that God's put around you to help you through these times. Maybe it's staying after church today so you don't have to pay for lunch because we already have lunch here. So all those different things. Jesus next takes us from the birds to the wildflowers. He says in verse 28, why do you worry about your clothes? Look, learn. And that word learn, it means observe something carefully so you can look at the details. There's more to it than just on the surface. Learn how the wildflowers of the field grow. How do they keep growing? How do flowers grow? I mean, don't stop and think about that process very often, right? We just enjoy them, or we take our lawnmower and we mow over them and forget about it. Or the sun here bakes them in a couple days and then they're gone. But how do they grow? Well, there's a seed that goes into the ground, and from that point, God provides. He's provided nutrients in the soil and the worms that aerate the soil. And then there's the sunshine that God's provided as well. And then there's the rain, although here we don't get as much, that God provides. And all those things come together, and that wildflower blooms into something beautiful. And it just happens because God provides everything that's necessary. He sustains it through natural processes that the earth already has in place. And I think that's something that a lot of us lose touch with as well. God can also sustain us through many things that are available in his natural world. And in our society, we tend to be very, we tend to kind of get distance in some ways from nature. Not so much maybe here because there's so much beautiful nature all around us for us to enjoy. But even still, you can walk down the street and hit up a supermarket. And so we get our things in packages for the most part, or containers or on the shelf. But we could experiment with gardening or farming We have some chickens in our yard, so we've been experimenting with that recently with eggs and things of that nature. Or living off the land. So maybe cultivating a raised bed garden, or raising a few chickens, or planting some fruit trees, or learning how to bake something from scratch, or trying a new food, maybe even one that tastes better and costs less, or expanding your cooking skills, or learning about some of the native plants in our environment that are available that could also be used for foods. Those are different things that God's put around you and around me in the natural world, and ways that we could better use the resources. Maybe he's already put the things that you need right around you in his world. You just don't realize that yet, just like he has for the flowers. He says in verse 29, I tell you, not even Solomon in all of his splendor was adorned like one of these flowers. And so the flowers, God kind of goes above and beyond. They're beautiful. And sometimes God will go above and beyond for us as well. He might even surpass our needs in different ways. Verse 30 says, if that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and thrown into the furnace tomorrow, won't he do much more for you? You have little faith. Jesus uses that phrase a lot, you have little faith, because he's always training people to trust him. He does that to his 12 disciples when they're in the boat, they're in the storm, and it starts filling up with water, and Jesus is just sleeping in the back of the boat, and everyone's going crazy. They think they're going to sink, and they think they're going to die on the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus says, you have little faith. Where's your faith? He's always training us to trust him. And he allows these difficult, tight, anxiety-producing circumstances because he wants to train us to trust him. He will provide, but we have to believe that he will. We have to see him as a good, kind master, as a loving father who wants to be involved in our lives. He says, won't he do much more for you? Because he sees you as somebody who's very significant to him. You're significant. Would you not treat a significant person in your life well? And oftentimes we call people friends or spouses or other people in our lives significant others, right? Because they're significant to us. And you're one of God's significant others. And he'll take care of you, even if it feels like because of your concerns that he won't do that. And then finally, he says this in verse 27, can any of you add a single cubit, which is a meter, essentially, not quite that long, about half a meter or about 1.5 feet. Can any of you add that much to your height? And that term in those days could also mean to your life. So can you make yourself taller? Can you make yourself live longer? I mean, can you really guarantee that's going to happen by worrying? He says, no, that's not possible. What good is it? Worrying is actually futile. It doesn't do anything for us. It feels like it would be helpful, but it doesn't really accomplish anything productive. And so he addresses those concerns and points our perspective to the Father. In verses 31 and 32, he's going to take a look at our confidence and where our confidence is at. He's going to compare it with where people put their confidence in his day and age at that point in time. In verse 31, he says, so, in conclusion, after all the things I've shared, these different truths about God and about money, don't worry, saying, what are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? What are we going to wear? How are we going to afford gas? Are we going to do all these things? He says, for the idolaters, that's really not the greatest translation. The idolaters eagerly seek all these things. So the term idolaters, it's translated Gentiles in some Bible translations as well. But it actually was the term is ethnos. We get ethnic groups from it. And so that term actually means people not of different skin tones as we think of maybe ethnicities today, but more of cultures. And so there are different cultures around Jesus. And in Jesus' day, Judaism was kind of unique. Judaism was one of the very few monotheistic cultures, so the cultures that had one God. Most of the cultures in the Roman Empire believed in many, many different gods or goddesses. They had temples on the street corners, many temples in most big cities for different gods or different goddesses to worship them. And so there's a multiplicity of gods, goddesses, statues. We go to the statue at the temple to worship the god or goddess. Only Zoroastrianism, I think, which is more of a Persian religion, that was monotheistic, and maybe a couple of early Chinese religions. But besides that, Judaism was one of the few, within the Roman Empire, probably the only monotheistic religion. And so these people who worshiped idols or these other gods and goddesses in statue form, he says these people, in those cultures, life It revolves around the quest for satisfaction. They're always eagerly seeking these things they think they need to be satisfied. What are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? What are we going to wear? How are we going to experience pleasure in life? And that actually fits really well with who the gods and goddesses were in that world. The Greek and Roman goddesses, most of the time they were driven by passions, their own selfish passions, and most of the time they were very difficult to predict. We don't know what the god or the goddess is going to do next. We just don't know. And we contrast that with the idea of who the Bible presents God, our Father, to be. He is predictable. He is unchanging in nature. He is not selfish. He is selfless and loving and giving. And so you can imagine if your god or your goddess that you prefer is driven by selfish passions and kind of hard to predict, you're going to kind of follow suit. You're going to become like what you worship. And so these people were all driven by their passions. It was unpredictable, and they didn't know what was going to happen next, and they were just seeking their needs and their physical satisfaction. That's how life revolved for them. And people would take it into their own hands. We got to make sure that we get satisfied, so we're going to seek all these things in life that we think we need to be satisfied. All the resources or the wealth or the food or the experiences to be satisfied. And Jesus said, your heavenly Father, in the next phrase, he knows what you need. He knows you need these things. So your life doesn't have to get on a crazy cycle of chasing after all this stuff like many people in Greek and Roman culture did. You can relax. You can kind of experience some peace because your heavenly Father, God, he knows that you need these things. And he's a loving Father, and you're significant to him. So just trust he's going to take care of you and look in the world around you to see some of the ways that he might already have put provisions near you, or some of the things that you could do to bring the world around you, he's put around you, make that more accessible or put it to better use in order to provide for some of the needs that you have. God recognizes our needs. He wants to provide for us, and maybe he already has, or maybe he will through someone else near you who's also a follower of Christ. The last thing that Jesus leaves us with this morning, and that's where we're going to close, is by looking at our concentration, our focus, and what it's on. I had kind of a unique experience a few months ago. A friend of mine who used to attend here, and I have friends from different generations, okay? And this has been the case with me for a long, long time. So when I say my friend, I should say my 80-year-old friend, Sue. She lost her husband a few months ago. He passed away, and he was in his upper 80s, and she's in her early 80s. And I would check in on her once in a while after she lost her husband to see how she was doing, and she said, you know what? How would you feel about letting me teach you a game that I've enjoyed playing and that my husband enjoyed playing throughout his life? I said, okay, what's that game? She said, we like to play chess. Now, if you know the game chess, you know it's a little bit complicated, or it starts out kind of easy and gets more and more and more complicated, and it's sort of this bottomless pit of complication. You probably also know that somebody who's played chess for decades is going to be better than someone who's never played before. And so she started to have me over every few weeks to teach me how to play chess. By teach me, I mean she would play against me, and she would get me into these situations and then tell me what I should have done to avoid it over and over again. So she's just hammering on me and beating me time after time after time. And this 80-year-old lady is wrecking me in chess every week to teach me. But I had to be careful because I learned with chess, you have to stay concentrated. My mind would start to wander. I think she did it on purpose, but she'd put coffee out or sometimes these desserts out, and I think, oh, that's great, take a sip of it and get focused on that, or look out the window at the view at the mountain across the way, and all of a sudden I know like I'm in this terrible situation because I've lost focus, or I don't see a move that she's setting herself up for, because I've lost concentration. And I learned that if I play with her, I can't lose concentration. I always have to be focused on chess, that one thing, because if I do, it's over from that point. And I think she gets some pleasure out of that, out of beating me time and time again. And there's a focus that Jesus gives us here in this next verse that really has to stay the focus. We have to stay concentrated on a daily basis in our faith. Otherwise, we get really distracted, or we get really worried, or these different things, and we lose the focus that Jesus intends for our life. This is a common verse, But I'm starting through this study on the Sermon on the Mount, I think, to see this and what it means in a little bit newer light, at least a more expanded light. He says, but seek first, and that word first, it means foremost, of utmost importance. It means make it your top priority. Okay? Seek first the kingdom of God. We've been talking about that for several weeks now, and his righteousness. And we talked about God's righteousness a couple of weeks ago as well for 2 different messages. So seek first, foremost, make it your concentration or your priority, the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And that's the answer, coincidentally, to the question I think that we looked at a little bit earlier. This idea of, isn't there more to life than just food, drink, clothing, shelter, these needs? Life is supposed to be a lot more full than that. And the thing that life is supposed to be filled with is actually seeking God's kingdom and God's righteousness. And I would say what Jesus is trying to tell us is that if you want to have a full life, you don't necessarily need to visit 50 places on your bucket list. Not that that's a bad thing, but maybe that won't produce a fulfilled life. Maybe it's not about getting beyond paycheck to paycheck to having investment portfolios and having a secure retirement, being able to go on a cruise once every 6 months or something like that. Maybe that's not really where fulfillment's at. Maybe it's not even in having this, full family with kids who are creative and people who go on to successful careers and have families of their own. Maybe all those things can be important and valuable in life in different ways. But maybe when Jesus talks about abundant life or life being more than this, it's definitely more than wealth. We learned that last week. But maybe there's even more to it than that. Maybe it's seeking God's kingdom and God's righteousness. Maybe we can discover that the more our lives were intended for, maybe we can discover that we devote them to God's kingdom and God's righteousness. We've already talked about in this series how he wants his kingdom to become a present reality in our lives and in the lives of people around us. But a lot of people have different priorities. And Jesus has already given us a description. He's already described that, what his kingdom and his righteousness look like. Because those are very difficult things to wrap your mind around, right? How do you seek God's kingdom and how do you seek God's righteousness? What's that look like? Is that just obeying a set of rules? It's not. Let's review for a moment what Jesus has already taught us in this Sermon on the Mount. Here's how he's taught us to seek God's kingdom. This is a summary. 1, you can focus on eliminating some type of injustice in the world around you. It might be by befriending somebody who's ignored or lonely. I mean, that's not just when somebody has to live life isolated and lonely. Maybe it's by empowering somebody that's been overlooked or kind of left behind or has no ability to make decisions or have influence. Maybe it's by just telling somebody how valuable they are to you. Maybe it's by showing appreciation or sympathizing with somebody or giving something to somebody or making a compromise for someone else to take away some of it, just a little piece of the injustice that's happening in the world around us. That's one way we can seek God's kingdom. Another thing Jesus has told us, we can improve the condition of life on earth. We can put ourselves onto a project or onto a cause or onto a nonprofit, anything out there. Like the sky's the limit. What's going to make the world a better place for people? That's one way that we can seek God's kingdom. Another thing Jesus has talked about previously in this same message, we can offer hope or direction or salvation to somebody. Somebody talks about how hopeless their life is, how depressed they are, how they've been searching for something or even searching for God, but they don't really know where to find it. And you can share some of the things that you've experienced or how you found them in the process. And those conversations are seeking God's kingdom. You can serve somebody in a way that's meaningful to them. You can meet someone's basic need so that they're not suffering quite so much and they're not dealing with quite as much hardship. You can pray. Jesus talked about the Lord's Prayer a couple of weeks ago, what we call the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who is in heaven, holy is your name, those types of things. It was a model and it shows us different things that we can include in our prayer conversation. If you missed that, it's online. It's cataloged on our church YouTube channel, which is Mountain View Bible Church, Utah. And you can visit that on YouTube and find that message and review some of those things. But prayer is a way you can seek God's kingdom. You can fast for a specific reason. You can share some of your extra instead of spending it on your own ease and enjoyment. All those are very tangible, very practical ways that Jesus has already taught us in this message that we can seek God's kingdom. That's what it means. We can also seek his righteousness. And if you remember, we talked about righteousness, and we had to redefine it, because a lot of us, when we hear the term righteousness, we think, well, righteousness means a list of rules. And that's what the Pharisees, the religious leaders at Jesus' time, also thought righteousness meant. And so Jesus had to address that and redefine it, because you can't create a rule for everything. No matter how many rules you make, there's always going to be a need for another rule. And so it has to go beyond the rules to the relationships with people, to the heart. And if you look behind all the different rules that God gives in the Bible, the reason for those is always to draw us into relationship with other people or into relationship with God. Relationship, fostering the right kinds of relationships, is what God means by righteousness. It's not following a list of rules. It's developing better relationships with God and with the people that God's placed around you. And here's how we do that. Here's how we seek God's righteousness. Here's how we build better relationships. One, we can seek reconciliation. If there's a division right now between us and somebody in our family, or between us and God, we can seek to rebuild that relationship. And that's a part of seeking God's righteousness. We can prove ourselves to be reliable, so we can focus on keeping a commitment or fulfilling a promise that we made. Maybe it's a promise we made a long time ago, we never made good on, to a spouse or to a friend or to someone, maybe to one of our kids. We never made good on that. We can seek God's righteousness by keeping that commitment. We can give up one of our rights because it's going to benefit somebody else. We can give up one of our resources to benefit somebody else. And that's seeking God's righteousness. Because when you do that, other people, that draws them closer in a relationship. Or you can choose to love somebody that the majority of people in society would rather avoid or condemn or overlook. And that's how you can seek God's righteousness. So it seems like those qualities, God's kingdom and God's righteousness, are kind of vague. But really, Jesus has given us everything, almost everything so far in this very sermon, in the last 2 chapters of Matthew, that we need to actually practically do those things. And that's what he wants our concentration to be on. And he says if you do that, all these things, the things you're worried about, not having enough food, clothing, drink, all that, your Father's going to take care of you. If you just focus on him, he loves you, you're significant, he's going to take care of you. If you're devoted, he'll provide for you. And he says in his conclusion, therefore, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to worry about itself. That's really hard to live that, isn't it? Because it's so easy to worry about tomorrow and to read the news or look at the gas pump or look in the grocery and think, how am I going to make it happen tomorrow? But Jesus says, just focus on one day at a time. Focus on today. Today's got more than enough to deal with. He says each day has enough trouble of its own. Don't get into tomorrow. It's going to overwhelm you. Just focus on today. Trust God for today. Look around you at the resources he's already put in place around you, the things he's given you through his creation, and trust that he's going to take care of you. And even if that means, causing somebody else to notice the needs that you have and to help out in meeting those, God will take care of you. You don't have to worry. He wants to train our trust. And he's training all of our trust in different ways. That's why life is hard sometimes. Let's go ahead and close in prayer today. God, I thank you for these words. Jesus, I pray that you would teach each of us through what you have said in this chapter, in Matthew chapter 6. I pray that maybe if we're really struggling with some of these things like anxiety in our life right now, maybe it's attached to finances, maybe it's attached to something completely different. Just that we would be able to reread these words from Matthew 6 this week, and that as we do, you would soothe us and give us peace and help us to grow our trust and our faith in you, because sometimes it's small, especially when it gets on all the other things around us and all the fears and the concerns. Help us to remember who you are and how much you care for us, and help us also to be able to focus on the right things, the things that are going to seek your kingdom and seek your righteousness. We pray that in Christ's name. Amen.